The crisp white envelope felt impossibly heavy in my hands as I sat alone in my grandfather's study. The words "last will and testament" stared back at me, still unread. While outside the French doors, I could hear Eleanor, my husband's mother, loudly speculating about what dear old Grandpa Harris had left for her son. If only she knew the bombshell that was about to drop. My name is Zoe Mitchell, and this is how I discovered that family ties can unravel faster than a cheap sweater when money enters the picture. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You've been in here long enough, Zoe, Eleanor's voice cut through my thoughts as she appeared in the doorway, designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor. Everyone's waiting. Don't you think it's time we opened that? Her eyes fixated on the envelope in my hands with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I was just taking a moment, I replied, rising from my grandfather's leather chair. It's been less than a week since his funeral, Eleanor. My husband Mason appeared behind his mother, giving me an apologetic look. Mom's right, honey. Everyone's gathered. The attorney said we should all be present. I nodded, clutching the envelope to my chest. My grandfather had entrusted it to me personally the day before he passed, with strict instructions to open it only when the family was together. Just trying to honor his wishes, I said quietly. The dining room fell silent as I entered. My in-laws sat clustered at one end of the grand mahogany table, Eleanor at the center like a queen holding court, flanked by Mason's sisters Vanessa and Meredith and their husbands. At the other end were my parents, looking uncomfortable and out of place in this mansion that had been my grandfather's pride. Only my cousin Rebecca, who had been like a sister to me growing up, gave me an encouraging smile. Finally, Eleanor sighed dramatically as I took my seat. I swear, the way Harold doted on you, you'd think you were his only grandchild instead of just marrying into the family. I felt Mason stiffen beside me. 3 years of marriage, and he still hadn't learned to stand up to his mother when it came to her thinly veiled jabs at me. Grandpa Harris treated everyone with kindness, I said evenly, which is more than I can say for some. Let's not do this now, Mason whispered, squeezing my hand beneath the table. Please. I opened the envelope, hands trembling slightly. Within were 2 documents, the formal will and a sealed letter addressed to me in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. I set the letter aside and began reading the will aloud. I, Harold Joseph Harris, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath the following. My voice grew steadier as I read through the standard legal preamble. Various family heirlooms and smaller properties were distributed among relatives. A vacation cottage to my parents, his vintage car collection to be shared among his nephews, jewelry pieces to the women in the family. Eleanor leaned forward expectantly when I got to weigh the major assets. And to my grandson-in-law, Mason Mitchell, I leave my collection of first edition books and... I paused, double-checking the words. My sincere hope that he will find his own path in life. That's it? Eleanor interrupted, her voice rising. Books? What about the business, the estate, the investments? I continued reading. To my beloved granddaughter Zoe, who has shown true Harris determination and compassion, I leave my controlling interest in Harris Developments, the family estate including all properties and land holdings not otherwise specified, and my investment portfolio. The crystal chandelier seemed to dim as a shocked silence fell over the room. That's impossible, Eleanor finally sputtered, her face flushing crimson. Mason is his grandson by marriage. He should inherit the company, not you. There must be some mistake. It seems quite clear, Mrs. Mitchell, my father said, speaking for the first time. Harold knew exactly what he was doing. Eleanor's palm slammed against the table. This is absurd. Mason has an MBA. He's been working toward taking over that company since before he even met Zoe. And the estate? This house has been in the Harris family for generations. It should go to a Harris. I am a Harris, I reminded her quietly. By blood. Grandpa was my mother's father. A technicality, she hissed. Everyone knows Mason was like a son to Harold. He spent holidays here. Long before you two met. Tell them, Mason. All eyes turned to my husband, whose face had gone pale. I don't understand, he stammered, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. Did you know about this? Before I could answer, Eleanor rose from her chair. Of course she knew. Why else would she have married you? She's been planning this, worming her way into Harold's good graces, playing the devoted granddaughter while the rest of us weren't looking. That's enough, Eleanor, my mother interjected. You're upset, but don't take it out on Zoe. Eleanor ignored her, turning to Mason instead. You need to contest this will. It's clearly the result of undue influence. No sound-minded person would leave their entire legacy to someone who just happens to share their DNA over the person who's actually qualified to run it. Maybe he saw something in Zoe that you don't, Rebecca suggested, earning herself a withering glare from Eleanor. I reached for the sealed letter, breaking the wax seal and unfolding the pages. My grandfather's familiar handwriting brought tears to my eyes. My dearest Zoe, I read aloud, my voice wavering. If you're reading this, I've made my departure from this world, hopefully with the dignity I've tried to maintain throughout my life. I want you to know that my decision to leave you the bulk of my estate was not made lightly or hastily. For years, I've watched you grow from the quiet, thoughtful child who would sit with me in my study, discussing philosophy, into the capable, compassionate woman you are today. I paused, gathering myself before continuing. While others sought my approval through superficial means, you earned my respect through your honesty, your work ethic, and your genuine desire to make a difference. You alone among my family never saw me as a means to an end, or a problem to be managed. You saw me as a person. Oh, please, Eleanor scoffed, but Vanessa shushed her. I have watched with growing concern as you've tried to fit yourself into the Mitchell family mold, dimming your light to avoid casting shadows on others. I've seen you set aside your dreams of expanding our charitable foundation to play the role of the supportive wife to a man who, forgive my bluntness, lacks the spine to stand up for you or himself. Mason flinched beside me. The Harris legacy is not just wealth or property or even the company I built. It's about integrity, independence, and using your position to elevate others. I believe you embody these values, and I trust you to carry them forward, whether that includes Mason or not. Eleanor was practically vibrating with rage. This is character assassination. Harold was clearly not in his right mind when he wrote this. He was sharper than most of us until the very end, my father countered. You know that, Eleanor. I took a deep breath and read the final paragraph. My solicitor has instructions regarding the company and the legal transfer of assets. Everything will be handled smoothly, provided no one contests the will. Should that happen, a secondary provision will be triggered that I suspect none of you will find favorable. Trust yourself, Zoe. You're more capable than you know. With all my love, Grandpa. I folded the letter carefully and looked up to find everyone staring at me. Mason's face had gone from pale to flushed, his jaw clenching and unclenching as he processed his grandfather-in-law's assessment of him. This is outrageous, Eleanor declared, standing up and grabbing her purse. We're leaving. Mason, call Davis and Meyer first thing tomorrow. We're contesting this farce of a will. Mason remained seated, his gaze fixed on the table. Mason, Eleanor repeated, her voice hardening. Did you hear me? I heard you, Mother, he replied quietly. I heard everything. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Don't tell me you're actually considering accepting this? She gets everything, and you get some dusty books? This is your future we're talking about. It's my future too, I interjected, finding my voice. And apparently Grandpa thought I was capable of handling it. You? Eleanor laughed bitterly. You couldn't even finish your MBA. You dropped out to find yourself, or whatever nonsense you told Mason. I dropped out because Mason asked me to, I corrected her, years of pent-up frustration finally spilling over. Because he said it was putting too much pressure on our relationship if we were both pursuing the same career path. Because he couldn't handle the fact that I was outperforming him in every class. The room went still. Mason's head snapped up, panic flashing in his eyes. Zoe, that's not... It's exactly what happened. I cut him off. I've spent 3 years downplaying my abilities to protect your ego. I've watched you take credit for my ideas at family functions. I've smiled and nodded while your mother suggested I wasn't good enough for you, when the truth is... I stopped myself, suddenly aware of the audience. The truth is what? Eleanor challenged. Go ahead, say it. I looked directly at Mason. The truth is that your grandfather saw exactly who you are. A man with potential who's never had to work for anything because his mother handed it to him. A man who expects the world to operate the same way. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That's not fair, Mason protested weakly. No, what's not fair is you expecting to inherit a company you've contributed nothing to except your presence at holiday dinners, Rebecca chimed in. Uncle Harold built that company from nothing. He knew what he was doing. Eleanor's face had gone an alarming shade of red. Mason, are you going to let them talk to you this way, in front of everyone? Mason looked torn, glancing from his mother to me and back again. In that moment, I realized with perfect clarity that while I might have inherited a fortune, I'd lost my husband long ago, if I'd ever truly had him. You know what? Take it to court if you want, I said, rising from my chair and gathering the will documents. Grandpa clearly anticipated that reaction. I'm curious what his secondary provision entails. You think you've won, Eleanor hissed. But this isn't over. That company belongs in my family. It is in your family, my mother pointed out. Zoe is Mason's wife. For now, Eleanor muttered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. Mason's head jerked up. What's that supposed to mean? Eleanor smiled thinly. Well, darling, let's be realistic. With stakes this high, can you really trust her motives anymore? The implication hung in the air like poison gas. I waited for Mason to defend me, to shut down his mother's insinuation that I had somehow orchestrated all of this, or that I might use the inheritance as leverage in our marriage. Instead, he looked at me with uncertainty in his eyes. Zoe, maybe we should discuss how to approach this as a team. The company could still be a family business, with both of us involved. The casual way he assumed he'd have a role, after spending years telling me the corporate world wasn't my thing, was the final straw. I think I need some air, I announced, walking toward the door. I turned back one last time. For what it's worth, I didn't know what was in the will. Grandpa never told me. But now that I do know, I understand why he made the choice he did. He wanted his legacy protected by someone who valued it for more than its dollar signs. As I stepped into the garden, the evening air cool against my flushed skin, I heard footsteps behind me. It was Rebecca. That was quite a performance in there, she said, handing me a glass of my grandfather's favorite whiskey. You okay? I took a long sip, savoring the burn. I don't know. I just lost my husband, didn't I? Rebecca leaned against the stone, balustrade beside me. Maybe, or maybe you just found yourself. What do I do now? I whispered, staring out at the immaculate grounds that were apparently mine. Now? She clinked her glass against mine. Now you do exactly what Uncle Harold knew you could do. You rise to the occasion. Inside, I could hear Eleanor's voice rising again, followed by my father's measured tones. Mason was conspicuously silent. The family dinner had devolved into exactly the kind of chaos my grandfather had likely anticipated. The irony wasn't lost on me. Harold Harris had spent his life bringing people together through his philanthropy and business ventures, and in death, he'd exposed the fractures that had been there all along. I took another sip of whiskey and made a silent promise to my grandfather. Whatever came next, whether a court battle or a divorce or both, I would handle it with the dignity and determination he'd seen in me. The inheritance wasn't just money and property, it was his vote of confidence. And for the first time in years, I felt worthy of it. The French doors opened and Mason stepped out, his expression unreadable. The moment of truth had arrived. "Well?" I asked, bracing myself for whatever came next. "Have you and your mother decided on a strategy yet?" Mason took a deep breath, running his hand through his hair, a gesture I'd once found endearing, but now recognized as a stalling tactic. "Zoe, you have to understand how this looks. All these years, Harold and I had an understanding." "Did you?" I interrupted. "Or was that just something you told yourself? Because from where I'm standing, if he'd wanted you to have the company, he would have left it to you." "That's not fair," Mason protested. "You know how close we were." "I know. You thought you were close," I corrected him. "But maybe you only saw what you wanted to see." Behind Mason, through the glass doors, I could see Eleanor gesturing dramatically to Vanessa and Meredith. The battle lines were being drawn. "What happens now is up to you," I told him, setting down my glass. "You can fight me on this and trigger whatever contingency Grandpa put in place. Or you can accept his decision and we can figure out what our marriage looks like with this new dynamic." "That's just it," Mason said, his voice dropping. "Mom thinks she's worried that you might have influenced Harold, especially toward the end when he was ill." The accusation hung between us like an axe. "Your mother has never liked me," I said evenly. "But I never thought you'd actually believe I was capable of something like that." Mason didn't deny it, which was answer enough. I nodded slowly, a strange calm settling over me. "You know what? Mason, contest the will. Take me to court. Let everyone see exactly what kind of man you are, the kind who can't accept that his wife might be more capable than he is." "That's not what this is about." "Isn't it?" I challenged. "Because I don't remember you being this upset when you thought you were getting everything." The French doors opened again, and Eleanor emerged, her smile tight and predatory. "Mason, darling, we need to leave. I've called our attorney. He's meeting us first thing tomorrow." Mason hesitated, looking between his mother and me, the same choice he'd been making our entire relationship. And as always, I knew which way he'd go. "I'll get our coats," he said to Eleanor. "Not Zoe's," Eleanor replied smoothly. "I think she's quite comfortable here in her new home, don't you?" I didn't bother responding. There was nothing left to say. As they walked away, Rebecca rejoined me, slipping her arm through mine. "I've sent your parents and the others home. It's just us now." "Thanks," I murmured, watching my marriage disintegrate in real time. "For what it's worth," Rebecca said, "I think Uncle Harold would be proud of how you handled yourself tonight." For the first time since opening the will, I smiled genuinely. You know what? I think he would be too. Later that night, alone in my grandfather's study, my study now, I found another envelope tucked inside his desk drawer with my name on it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of names and phone numbers, his most trusted advisors, colleagues and friends, with a note at the bottom. "These people know the truth about the company and the family. They will stand with you when the storm comes. And it will come, my dear. The Mitchells have been trying to get their hands on Harris Developments for longer than you've been alive. Your marriage to Mason was their checkmate move, or so they thought. But remember this, the queen is the most powerful piece on the chessboard, not the king. Play to win, Zoe. I'll be watching from whatever comes next. I sat back in the leather chair, the weight of my grandfather's legacy settling on my shoulders. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and threats, and perhaps the end of my marriage. But tonight, for the first time in years, I felt something unexpected, stirring in my chest, freedom. Mason had made his choice. Now it was time to make mine. The law office of Blackwell & Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor of a gleaming downtown skyscraper, a far cry from the modest conference room where I'd first met with my grandfather's attorney after the disastrous family dinner 2 weeks ago. I straightened my blazer as the elevator ascended, grateful that Rebecca had insisted on accompanying me. The weight of the leather portfolio in my hands, filled with documents Grandpa had left for me, felt like armor. "Remember, you have nothing to apologize for," Rebecca murmured as the elevator doors slid open. "This meeting is happening on your terms, not theirs." The receptionist led us through a maze of hallways to a corner conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows. My breath caught when I saw who was waiting inside. Not just Mason and Eleanor, but also Vanessa and her husband Tyler, a tax attorney with political ambitions who had always treated me with barely disguised condescension. Beside them sat a silver-haired man I recognized as Jeffrey Porter, one of the most aggressive corporate attorneys in the city. "Quite the welcoming committee," Rebecca whispered. 2 people rose as we entered, Walter Blackwell, my grandfather's longtime legal counsel, and a younger woman I didn't recognize. "Ms. Harris," Walter greeted me, deliberately using my maiden name. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. This is Claire Donovan, my associate." "Mrs. Mitchell," Eleanor corrected with a tight smile, "though perhaps not for much longer." I ignored the jab. "Thank you for arranging this, Walter. I believe you've met my cousin Rebecca?" Walter nodded. "Of course. Now, shall we begin?" I took a seat directly opposite Mason, who wouldn't meet my eyes. He looked terrible, dark circles under his eyes, his normally perfect hair disheveled. A pang of something, not quite sympathy, not quite regret, flickered through me. Jeffrey Porter cleared his throat. "Before we begin, I'd like to state for the record that my clients believe Harold Harris was not of sound mind when he made his most recent will. We have documentation from his physician indicating declining health in the months before his passing." "Interesting," Walter replied mildly. "I have documentation from the same physician clearing Harold for all business and personal decisions until 3 days before his death, along with video recordings of our meetings where he explained in precise detail his reasons for every bequest." Eleanor's smile faltered. "Video recordings?" "Harold was nothing if not thorough," Walter said. "He anticipated resistance." "This isn't about resistance," Mason finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "It's about fairness. I worked alongside Harold for years. He mentored me. He promised you nothing," I interrupted, surprising myself with my steadiness. "If he had, it would be in writing." Mason flinched as if I'd slapped him. "You don't know everything that happened between us, Zoe." "Actually, she does," Walter interjected, placing a slim folder on the table. "Harold kept meticulous records of your contributions to Harris Developments, Mason, including the Westlake project you claimed credit for, which was actually Zoe's proposal from her MBA program, the one she abandoned at your request." Eleanor's face reddened. "That's absurd. Mason would never—" "Mom, don't," Mason warned, but it was too late. Walter slid a document across the table. Harold had a private investigator document every instance where Mason took credit for Zoe's work. He was disappointed. The room fell silent as Eleanor snatched up the document, her eyes widening as she scanned its contents. "This is character assassination," Jeffrey Porter declared. and irrelevant to our claim that the will represents an unnatural disposition of assets. Claire Donovan, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. Actually, it's directly relevant. These records establish a pattern of behavior that explains exactly why Mr. Harris made the choices he did. I didn't come here to be ambushed, Mason said, pushing back from the table. Then why did you come? I asked. Was it your idea to contest the will, or was it hers? I nodded toward Eleanor, whose knuckles had gone white around the document. She held. Don't answer that, Porter advised quickly. You don't need to, I continued. I know how this works, Mason. I've watched it our entire marriage. You have an opinion until your mother has a different one. Then suddenly, magically, your opinion changes. That's not fair, Mason protested. What's not fair, Rebecca interjected, is dragging Zoe through a legal battle because you can't accept that someone saw her value more clearly than you did. Eleanor stood abruptly. This is a waste of time. Jeffrey, we should proceed with filing. Before you do that, Walter interrupted smoothly, you might want to hear about the secondary provision in Harold's will, the one that triggers automatically if anyone contests his wishes. That got everyone's attention. Even Porter looked uncertain. Walter nodded to Claire, who produced another document. In the event that Mason Mitchell, Eleanor Mitchell, or any member of the Mitchell family contests this will, all assets initially bequeathed to Mason Mitchell shall instead be donated to the Harris Foundation for Women in Business, and Mason Mitchell shall be permanently removed from any position or association with Harris Developments, including the termination of his current employment contract under Section 7, Paragraph 3, Moral Turpitude. You can't be serious, Eleanor gasped. Furthermore, Claire continued reading, any legal expenses incurred by Zoe Harris in defending this shall be paid directly from the trust fund previously established for Mason Mitchell by his grandfather, Robert Mitchell. The blood drained from Eleanor's face. Robert's trust fund? How did Harold even know about that? Old men talk, Walter said simply. Robert and Harold were friends long before you married into the Mitchell family, Eleanor. They had an understanding. Mason looked stunned. My grandfather's trust fund? But that's my safety net. Your backup plan? I suggested, the pieces finally falling into place. In case marrying me didn't get you what you wanted? It wasn't like that, Mason insisted, but his eyes betrayed him. For 3 years, I'd ignored the signs, making excuses for his behavior, for the way his ambition always seemed to align perfectly with his mother's wishes. I'd convinced myself that his periodic distancing was just stress, that his reluctance to start a family was just prudent planning. Now, looking at him across the polished mahogany table, I saw what my grandfather had seen all along, a man whose loyalty would always be for sale to the highest bidder. I'd like to make a counteroffer, I said, surprising everyone, including myself. Porter leaned forward. We're listening. I'll guarantee Mason's position at Harris Developments for 1 year, with the same salary and benefits. During that time, he can prove his value to the company. If he demonstrates genuine initiative and contribution, we can discuss a more permanent arrangement. And if he doesn't? Eleanor demanded. Then he walks away with a fair severance package and his reputation intact. No moral turpitude clause invoked. No public spectacle. I turned to Mason directly. You always said you wanted to earn your place. Here's your chance to do it for real, without your mother or me or anyone else pulling strings. Mason looked conflicted, glancing between his mother and me. It's a trap, Eleanor declared. She'll sabotage you, make it impossible for you to succeed. Unlike you, Rebecca commented. Zoe actually believes in meritocracy. Jeffrey Porter leaned over to whisper something to Eleanor, whose face underwent a rapid series of expressions. Anger, calculation, and finally, reluctant acceptance. We need to discuss this privately, Porter announced. Walter nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. The secondary provision won't be triggered unless you formally file a contest to the will. As the Mitchell contingent filed out for their private discussion, Rebecca squeezed my hand. That was brilliant. Was it? I wasn't sure where the offer had come from, only that it felt right. A chance to honor my grandfather's wishes while giving Mason an opportunity to become the man I'd once thought he was. Harold would have approved, Walter assured me. He always said you had good instincts for when to extend an olive branch and when to wield a sword. 20 minutes later, the Mitchells returned. Eleanor's face was a mask of contained fury, but Mason looked almost relieved. We accept your offer with the following conditions, Porter announced. First, Mason will report directly to the board of directors, not to you. Second, his performance will be evaluated by an independent consultant, not by Harris Developments Management. And third, the severance package, should it become necessary, will equal 1 year's salary plus benefits. I glanced at Walter, who gave a subtle nod. Agreed, I said. Claire, would you draft the necessary amendments? As Claire began typing on her laptop, an uncomfortable silence fell over the room. I realized that everyone was waiting for me, the novice, the inexperienced granddaughter, to make the next move. One more thing, I added. Effective immediately, I'll be taking a leave of absence from my position at the Herald to focus on learning the company. I'd appreciate it if someone could arrange for my grandfather's office to be prepared. Harold's actual office? Vanessa spoke for the first time, sounding scandalized. But no one's used it since he semi-retired 5 years ago. I finished for her. I'm aware, but as the new majority shareholder and CEO, I think it's appropriate. The title hung in the air, CEO, making real what had until now been theoretical. I was no longer just Zoe, Mason's quiet wife with the famous grandfather. I was now the head of a company with over 300 employees and assets in the 9 figures. Tyler, Vanessa's husband, cleared his throat. I assume you'll be appointing an experienced CEO to manage day-to-day operations while you acclimate? The condescension in his voice was palpable. Actually, Walter interjected before I could respond. Harold specifically addressed this in his letter of instruction to the board. Let me see. He flipped through the folder. Ah, here it is. While I recognize that Zoe may require time to develop certain technical skills, her integrity, intelligence, and vision for the company's future are precisely what Harris Developments needs. I expect the board to support her transition to CEO with all necessary resources, but the authority must remain firmly in her hands. Eleanor made a small, disgusted sound, which Mason silenced with a look. If there's nothing else, Walter concluded, Claire will have the agreements ready for signature by tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I suggest we all take some time to adjust to the new reality. As the meeting broke up, Mason lingered, motioning for his mother and the others to go ahead without him. Can we talk? He asked once we were alone. Really talk, without lawyers and family watching our every move? Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the professional distance that had somehow made this awful situation bearable. But another part, the part that had fallen in love with him once, couldn't help but wonder if there was something worth salvaging. 5 minutes, I conceded. In the lobby. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Want me to wait? I'll be fine, I assured her. I'll meet you at the car. The lobby cafe was nearly empty at this hour. Mason ordered 2 coffees, remembering exactly how I took mine, and we settled at a table far from the entrance. You were impressive in there, he began, turning the coffee cup in his hands without drinking. Grandpa Harris would have been proud. Don't do that, I said quietly. Don't pretend this is what you wanted. Mason sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know what I want anymore, Zoe. For years I had this plan. Take over the company, make my family proud, build something lasting. Then you came along, and suddenly there was this whole other future possible. One where maybe it wasn't all about achievement and expectations. But you never chose that future, I pointed out. Not really. When it came down to it, you always defaulted to your mother's vision for your life. She sacrificed everything for me after Dad left, Mason said, the familiar justification sounding hollow even to my ears. Her whole identity is wrapped up in my success. And what about my identity? I asked. Where does that fit in your worldview? Mason had no answer, just as he'd had no answer all the times before when I'd tried to carve out space for my own ambitions. I want to try, he said finally. The job, the marriage, all of it. I want to prove I can be the man you thought I was. The sincerity in his voice almost swayed me. Almost. But then I remembered my grandfather's words in his letter. I've watched with growing concern as you've tried to fit yourself into the Mitchell family mold, dimming your light to avoid casting shadows on others. I don't think that's possible, I said gently. Not anymore. Too much has happened. Too much has been revealed. Your mother will never accept me as your equal, let alone your superior at the company. And honestly, Mason, I'm not sure you can either. So that's it? 3 years of marriage? Thrown away because of one inheritance? No, I corrected him. 3 years of marriage acknowledged for what it really was, a business arrangement I didn't realize I'd signed up for. Mason flinched. That's not fair. Isn't it? Tell me something. If the will had gone the other way, if your grandfather had left everything to you, would we be sitting here right now? Or would you be celebrating with your mother, planning how to run the company your way? His silence was answer enough. That's what I thought, I said, standing up. For what it's worth, I meant what I said in that meeting. You have a chance to prove yourself on your own merits. I hope you take it. And us? Mason asked, looking suddenly vulnerable. Is there any chance for us? I hesitated, feeling the weight of the diamond ring still on my finger. I don't know. But I do know this. Whatever happens next, it needs to be because we both want it, not because it's convenient or expected or part of someone else's plan for our lives. I turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. I'll be moving back into the guest house on my grandfather's property. You can stay in our condo for now. It's closer to the office anyway. Zoe, Mason called after me. I never meant to hurt you. I looked back at him, this handsome, troubled man who'd been the center of my world for so long. I know. That's what makes it worse. The rain had started by the time Rebecca and I pulled through the ornate gates of the Harris estate. The sprawling main house stood dark and imposing against the gray sky, but the small guest house nestled among the gardens glowed with warm light. Someone had turned on the lamps and started a fire in the hearth, Rebecca's doing most likely. Home sweet home, she quipped as we dashed from the car, getting soaked despite our efforts. At least temporarily. Inside, the guest house was exactly as I remembered from my teenage summers. Cozy, unpretentious, filled with books and comfortable furniture that had no place in the grand main house. My grandfather had used it as his personal retreat, a place where he could escape the pressures of business and family expectations. How appropriate that it would now serve the same purpose for me. I had the staff bring some of your things from the condo, Rebecca explained, gesturing to several suitcases in the bedroom. Just the essentials, clothes, toiletries, that hideous throw pillow you insist on keeping. It's not hideous. It's sentimental, I defended, picking up the worn pillow embroidered with a quote from Jane Austen, a gift from my mother on my 16th birthday. Same thing, Rebecca shrugged, heading to the kitchen. I also had them stock the fridge. If I know, you and I do, You haven't eaten a proper meal since this whole inheritance mess started. I followed her, suddenly aware of my gnawing hunger. The last thing I remember eating was a stale muffin from the break room at the Herald yesterday. See? Tragic. Rebecca began pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. Sit. I'm making pasta. And you're going to eat every bite while telling me how you really feel about all of this? I sank into a chair at the small kitchen table, watching as my cousin efficiently chopped onions and garlic. I don't know how I feel. Overwhelmed, terrified, maybe a little exhilarated. All normal, Rebecca assured me, pouring a generous splash of wine into a saucepan. You've had your entire life turned upside down in the span of 2 weeks. Anyone would be reeling. It's not just the inheritance or the company, I admitted. It's Mason. Finding out that your marriage isn't what you thought it was. It's like the ground disappearing beneath your feet. Rebecca paused her cooking to pour 2 glasses of wine, sliding one toward me. You know what I think? I think you've known for a long time that something wasn't right. You just didn't have a name for it until now. I took a long sip, letting the rich Cabernet warm me from the inside. Maybe. I always felt like I was performing in my marriage, trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect Mitchell daughter-in-law, never quite measuring up. Because the measuring stick kept changing, Rebecca pointed out, returning to her sauce. Eleanor moved the goalposts every time. You got close. The truth of her words settled over me like a heavy blanket. How many times had I rearranged my schedule to accommodate a last-minute Mitchell family event? How often had I bitten my tongue when Eleanor criticized my clothes, my career choices, even the way I arranged flowers? The constant vigilance had become so normal I'd stopped noticing it. Do you think Grandpa knew? I asked. About all of it, I mean. Mason, Eleanor, the way they treated me? Rebecca's expression softened. I think Uncle Harold saw everything. He didn't miss much, especially when it came to people he loved. The pasta was delicious, simple but perfect, like so many things I'd denied myself in the pursuit of Eleanor's approval. As we ate, the rain intensified, drumming against the windows and roof in a soothing rhythm. What happens tomorrow? Rebecca asked, refilling our wine glasses. First day as the big boss? I grimaced. God, I hadn't even thought about it like that. I have to walk into that building and somehow convince a room full of executives twice my age that I belong there. Correction, Rebecca said firmly. You have to walk into that building that you own, sit in the office that belongs to you, and begin making the decisions that are yours to make. Whether they think you belong there is irrelevant. Easy for you to say. You've always known exactly who you are. Rebecca laughed. Are you kidding? I'm a 32-year-old art curator who still can't commit to a paint color for her bedroom. The difference is, I don't apologize for my uncertainty. I own it. I considered this as I twirled pasta around my fork. Grandpa always said the first rule of business was to never let them see you sweat. Uncle Harold had a lot of rules, Rebecca mused, but he also knew when to break them. Remember when he showed up at that stuffy charity gala in sneakers because his feet hurt? The society pages were scandalized, but he didn't care. The memory made me smile. My grandfather, imposing in his custom suit but utterly ridiculous in bright white running shoes, dancing with my grandmother, as if he hadn't broken every unwritten rule of proper attire. I'm going to need to channel a lot more of that don't give a damn energy, I said. Good thing it runs in the family, Rebecca replied, raising her glass in a toast. To breaking rules and taking names. I clinked my glass against hers. To Grandpa Harris, who apparently planned the greatest mic drop in family history from beyond the grave. We laughed, and for the first time since the will reading, I felt a glimmer of possibility. Not just determination to survive this ordeal, but genuine excitement for what might lie ahead. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the rain having washed away the mugginess of late summer. I stood in front of the guest house mirror, assessing my appearance with a critical eye. The charcoal gray suit was conservative but well-tailored, my grandfather's vintage watch a subtle statement on my wrist. I'd pulled my hair back into a sleek chignon that Eleanor had always claimed made me look severe. Exactly the effect I wanted today. As I fastened a pair of simple pearl earrings, my mother's, not the ostentatious diamonds Mason had given me for our anniversary, my phone buzzed with a text message. Don't forget who you are and whose granddaughter you are. Call if you need. Reinforcements. R. Rebecca, ever the supportive cousin. I smiled, typing back a quick thank you before slipping the phone into my purse. The drive to Harris Development's headquarters took exactly 17 minutes, a fact I'd noted countless times when accompanying my grandfather, but had never particularly cared about until now. The imposing glass and steel building in the heart of downtown housed not just the company offices, but also several prestigious tenants who paid handsomely for the Harris address. As I pulled into the reserved parking space with CEO stenciled on the sign, a flutter of nerves threatened to undermine my carefully constructed confidence. What did I know about running a major development company? My journalism background and incomplete MBA hardly qualified me for this role. Then I remembered the portfolio still in my bag, the one my grandfather had left for me, filled with notes on ongoing projects, assessments of key personnel, and his vision for the company's future. He hadn't just given me a title, he'd given me a roadmap. The security guard at the lobby desk did a double take as I approached. Mrs. Mitchell, Ms. Harris, we weren't expecting you until next week. Change of plans, Carl, I replied, remembering his name from the visitor logs I'd signed countless times. Is Jennifer in yet? I'll need to speak with her first thing. Jennifer Zhao had been my grandfather's executive assistant for over a decade, the person who truly kept the company running smoothly during his semi-retirement. If anyone could help me navigate this transition, it would be her. Yes, ma'am. She's already upstairs. Shall I let her know you're coming up? No need. I'd like to surprise her. And avoid giving the executive floor time to prepare for my arrival, I added silently. The elevator ride to the top floor seemed both interminable and far too short. When the doors slid open, I stepped into the familiar reception area with its soaring ceilings and massive Harris Developments logo mounted on the wall. Several people looked up from their desks, expressions ranging from shock to curiosity to poorly concealed hostility. Jennifer rose immediately from her desk, her professionalism overriding whatever surprise she might have felt. Ms. Harris, welcome. Thank you, Jennifer. Is my grandfather's office ready? Yes, though we weren't expecting you until next week, I know. Plans change. Could you please arrange for the executive team to meet me in the conference room in 30 minutes? And I'll need the files on the Riverside project. If Jennifer was startled by my directness, she didn't show it. Of course. Would you like coffee in your office? Please. Black. No sugar. I headed toward the imposing double doors at the end of the hallway, feeling every eye in the reception area following my progress. My grandfather's office, my office now, was exactly as I remembered it, with one notable exception. The wall of family photographs behind the desk had been rearranged. The central frame, which had once held a picture of my grandparents on their wedding day, now contained a photograph I'd never seen before. My grandfather and me at my college. Graduation, both of us beaming as I clutched my diploma. The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd painted it on the wall. You belong here. I set my purse and portfolio on the desk and walked to the window, taking in the panoramic view of the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Eleanor was probably already plotting her next move. Mason was deciding whether to fight for our marriage or abandon it as a failed strategy. The board members were questioning my grandfather's judgment. Let them, I thought, touching the cool glass with my fingertips. This is my company now. My legacy. my future. A soft knock at the door announced Jennifer's arrival with coffee and a stack of files. The Riverside documents, as requested, and I've scheduled the executive meeting for 9:30. Thank you, Jennifer. I accepted the coffee gratefully. Before that happens, I'd like your honest assessment of something, off the record. Jennifer raised an eyebrow, but nodded. Of course. How bad is it going to be? The resistance, I mean. She considered this carefully, her expression giving nothing away. On a scale of 1 to 10, about a 7. There are allies on the executive team, people who respected your grandfather, and will transfer that respect to you. And there are those who've been waiting for a chance to implement changes that Harold resisted. And the others? I pressed. The others will wait to see which way the wind blows. Right now, they're placing their bets on Mason and his mother, making a successful play to unseat you. I nodded, appreciating her candor. And where do you stand in all this, Jennifer? A small smile quirked at the corner of her mouth. I stand where I've always stood, with Harris Developments. Your grandfather built something special here, something worth preserving. But does it need to be preserved exactly as it is? I challenged. Or can it evolve? Jennifer's smile widened. Now you sound like Harold. He asked me almost the same question the day he decided to pivot the company towards sustainable development. I hadn't known about that decision. Another reminder of how much I had to learn. And what did you tell him? I told him that the best companies are like rivers, not monuments. They adapt to the landscape while carving their own path. She gestured to the files on the desk. The Riverside project is your first test. It's controversial, expensive, and potentially transformative for the company's future direction. I flipped open the top folder, scanning the executive summary. A mixed-use development on former industrial land, incorporating affordable housing, clean energy initiatives, and public green spaces. Ambitious, expensive, and exactly the kind of project that would make traditional developers nervous. Who's against it? I asked. The fiscal conservatives on the board, led by Richard Mercer. He thinks it's too risky, too expensive, and too idealistic. Jennifer emphasized the last word with a slight wrinkle of her nose. The executive team is split. You'll hear all about it in... She checked her watch. 22 minutes. Thank you, Jennifer, for everything. I meant it. Her straightforward assessment had given me more confidence than a dozen pep talks. She nodded, turning to leave. One more thing, Ms. Harris. Your grandfather kept a small notepad in the top right drawer of his desk. Before difficult meetings, he would write down the 3 things he absolutely wouldn't compromise on. It helped him stay focused when the arguments got heated. After she left, I opened the drawer and found the notepad, its pages filled with my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. On the final used page, dated just 2 weeks before his death, were 3 bullet points. Riverside goes forward as planned, non-negotiable. Zoe takes over, everything else is secondary. Mitchell involvement contingent on merit only. My throat tightened as I traced his handwriting with my fingertips. Even then, he'd been planning for this moment, laying the groundwork for my success. I turned to a fresh page and uncapped a pen, considering what my own non-negotiables would be for the upcoming meeting. By the time Jennifer returned to escort me to the conference room, I had my own list memorized and a clear vision of how to buy. Proceed. The executive team rose as I entered, some promptly, others with reluctant tardiness. Mason was already seated, looking uncomfortable but determined. I noted with interest that he'd chosen a seat halfway down the table rather than at the head or foot, positioning himself as neither leader nor subordinate. Good morning, I greeted them, taking my place at the head of the table without hesitation. Thank you for accommodating this last-minute meeting. I know you all have busy schedules. Richard Mercer, the CFO my grandfather had once described, as brilliant with numbers but blind to possibilities, cleared his throat. We were under the impression that there would be a transition period before you assumed. Active management. Plans change, Richard, I replied smoothly. And while I appreciate everyone's concern for my adjustment period, I assure you I'm quite capable of learning while doing. No one doubts your intelligence, Zoe, Mason interjected, his tone carefully neutral. But Harris Developments is a complex organization with ongoing projects involving hundreds of millions of dollars. A misstep could have serious consequences. Several heads nodded in agreement. I noted who they were, filing away the information for later. You're absolutely right, Mason, I said, surprising him, which is why I've spent the last week reviewing every active project in our portfolio, starting with Riverside. I opened the file in front of me, letting the silence stretch just long enough to be noticeable. I understand there's been some disagreement about whether to proceed with this development as planned. I'd like to hear all perspectives before making a final decision. Richard Mercer launched into a detailed explanation of why the project should be scaled back. The profit margins were too thin, the affordable housing component too large, the sustainability features too expensive to implement. I listened, attentively, asking clarifying questions that demonstrated I'd done my homework. When he finished, I turned to Diane Chen, the head of our design division and one of my grandfather's most trusted innovators. Diane, you've championed this project from the beginning. What's your perspective? For the next hour, I guided the discussion carefully, giving each person time to speak while maintaining firm control of the meeting. I noted which executives deferred to Mason, which ones seemed genuinely interested in exploring new ideas, and which ones were simply waiting to see who would emerge victorious from the power struggle before committing themselves. Finally, as the debate circled back to the financial risks, I held up a hand. I've heard enough to make a decision. Riverside will proceed as planned, with 2 modifications. Richard Mercer looked triumphant until I continued. First, we'll increase the affordable housing component by 10%. His expression darkened. That will further reduce our profit margin. Which brings me to the second modification. We'll be establishing a separate charitable foundation, the Harold Harris Community Development Fund, to subsidize the additional affordable units. My grandfather left me personal assets as well as company shares. I'll be using a portion of those assets to seed the foundation. A stunned silence fell over the room. Even Mason looked surprised. That's unusually generous, Diane Chen said carefully. It's not generosity, it's good business, I corrected her. The foundation will qualify for tax benefits that offset much of the cost, and the expanded affordable component will make us eligible for additional government incentives that Richard hasn't factored into his projections. I turned to the CFO. Isn't that right, Richard? He shifted uncomfortably. There are some programs we might qualify for, yes, but the application process is competitive and we have an excellent government relations team that should be able to navigate that process successfully, I finished for him. If they can't, we should be having a different conversation about our staffing. The implied threat wasn't subtle, and I watched as Richard recalibrated his assessment of me in real time. Jennifer will circulate updated projections for the Riverside project by end of day, I continued. I expect each department to review them and provide feedback by Friday. We break ground next month as scheduled. I stood, signaling the end of the meeting. One more thing. I understand there's been uncertainty about the direction of the company since my grandfather's passing. Let me be clear. Harris Developments will continue to pursue projects that balance profitability with social responsibility. That was Harold's vision, and it remains mine. Anyone who can't align with that vision should consider their options accordingly. As the executives filed out, some looking shell-shocked, others intrigued, Mason lingered behind. Once we were alone, he let out a low whistle. That was impressive. Grandpa would have been proud. Thank you, I said, gathering my notes. I meant what I said about the foundation. It's a good compromise. Mason nodded slowly. It is. It addresses both the financial concerns and the mission objectives. He hesitated. Zoe, about us. Not here. I cut him off gently. This is work. That's personal. Let's try to keep them separate for now. He looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it. Fair enough. I'll see you at the budget meeting tomorrow. I'll be there. After he left, I returned to my office and sank into my grandfather's chair, my chair, feeling the adrenaline of the past 2 hours finally ebbing away. On my desk, beside the photograph of my graduation, someone had placed a small silver frame I hadn't noticed earlier. Inside was a handwritten note in my grandfather's distinctive script. The first day is the hardest. The second day is when the real work begins. You're ready for both. H. I touched the frame gently, feeling a curious mixture of grief and determination. Whatever came next, whether battles with the board or confrontations with Eleanor or difficult decisions about my marriage, I would face it with the same clarity and purpose I'd found today. The river was carving a new path forward, adapting to the changed landscape while staying true to its essential nature. And I was finally ready to flow with it, not against it. 6 months can change everything. I realized this as I stood on the rooftop garden of the nearly completed Riverside development, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of amber and gold. The autumn air carried a hint of the coming winter, but the garden was warm, with the last remnants of summer, fragrant herbs and late-blooming flowers thriving in their carefully designed beds. Ms. Harris? Jennifer's voice broke through my reverie. The investors are all here. They're waiting in the model unit whenever you're ready. Thank you, Jennifer. I'll be down in 5 minutes. I took one last look at the view, at what we'd accomplished in such a short time. 6 months ago, this had been nothing but contaminated soil and the rusted skeletons of abandoned warehouses. Now it was the most talked-about development project in the city. I smoothed down my dress, a deep emerald silk that brought out the green in my eyes, and made my way to the elevator. The model unit on the 7th floor had been finished just yesterday, a showcase of the sustainable, innovative design that had become Harris Development's new calling card. In the sleek living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows, a dozen of the city's most influential investors mingled, champagne glasses in hand. I spotted Mason immediately, engaged in animated conversation with the mayor. He looked good, healthier than he had in months, with a confidence that seemed to come from within rather than from his tailored suit or his family name. "Here she is!" Diane Chen exclaimed, swooping in to take my arm. "The visionary behind the transformation you're witnessing tonight." "Hardly," I demurred, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing server. I just had the good sense to trust the actual visionaries in our company. And the courage to increase the affordable housing component when everyone said it would sink the project, Richard Mercer added, surprising me with his support. Our relationship had evolved from barely concealed hostility to grudging respect over the past months, as Riverside had proven its viability. The mayor approached, Mason trailing slightly behind. Zoe Harris, the woman who's single-handedly redefining what urban renewal looks like in this city. His handshake was firm, his smile genuine. "I've just been telling your husband that the city council is unanimously impressed with what you've accomplished here." "That's high praise coming from a group that rarely agrees on anything," I replied, hyper-aware of Mason standing so close, of the word husband that no longer quite fit. We hadn't divorced. An unspoken truce had settled between us as we both focused on the Riverside project, but we hadn't reconciled either. He still lived in the condo downtown while I remained in the guest house on my grandfather's estate. "We're particularly interested in the community health center you've included," the mayor continued. "It's a model we'd like to see replicated in other developments." "That was actually Mason's initiative," I said, giving credit where it was due. He saw an opportunity to partner with University Hospital that the rest of us had overlooked. Mason looked surprised at my acknowledgement. It was a team effort. A successful one, the mayor agreed. Which is why I'm hoping both of you might join the Planning Commission's special session next month. We'd love your input on the city's 5-year development plan. We'd be honored, Mason answered for both of us, falling into the old habit of making joint decisions. Then, catching himself, he glanced at me. That is, if Zoe's schedule permits. I'll make it work, I assured the mayor, ignoring the ripple of awareness that passed between Mason and me. After 6 months of careful professionalism, these small moments of synchronicity still caught me off guard. As the evening progressed, I circulated among the investors, answering questions about the development's innovative features and sustainability metrics. The financial projections looked better than even I had hoped, with pre-sales exceeding targets and commercial spaces nearly fully leased before completion. It was a triumph by any measure. Professional validation that I'd made the right decisions despite the doubters. Yet as I stood listening to a banking executive praise the project's careful balance of social impact and financial return, I couldn't help but scan the room for Mason, wondering what he was thinking, whether he felt the same mix of pride and wistfulness that I did. I found him on the balcony, away from the crowd, staring out at the city lights. For a moment, I hesitated, tempted to leave him to his thoughts. Then he turned, as if sensing my presence, and something in his expression made my decision for me. Quite a night, I said, joining him at the railing. Quite a 6 months, he countered, his voice soft with something that might have been regret or might have been admiration. Perhaps both. You've proven all of them wrong, you know. The board members who said you weren't ready. The investors who were skeptical about the changes to the original plan. Not all of them, I reminded him. You supported the health center addition. That made a difference with the board. Mason shrugged, turning his champagne glass in his hands. It was the right decision for the project. I just recognized that before some of the others. We stood in silence for a moment, the muted sounds of the party washing over us from inside. 6 months of working together professionally while living separate personal lives had created a strange intimacy between us, a shared language of project milestones and corporate politics that had somehow become easier than discussing what had gone wrong in our marriage. I saw your mother on the society page last week, I said finally, breaking the silence. The hospital fundraiser looked impressive. Mason grimaced. You know how she is about appearances. She's still furious. About everything. But she's channeling it into charity work rather than direct confrontation. Progress, I suppose. Has she forgiven you for not contesting the will? I asked, the question that had lingered unspoken between us for months. Not entirely, but she's gradually accepting that I'm making my own decisions now. He glanced. At me, a hint of his old charm surfacing. She nearly had an aneurysm when I supported your health center proposal against Richard's objections. Despite myself, I laughed. I can imagine. Zoe, Mason began, his tone shifting to something more serious. I've been meaning to ask you something. My heart stuttered, a Pavlovian response to that particular inflection in his voice. Yes? The lease on the condo is up next month. I've been looking at places, but before I commit to anything, I wanted to know if there's any chance we might. The balcony door slid open before he could finish, and Jennifer appeared, looking apologetic. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Channel 7 news crew is here for that interview you scheduled, Ms. Harris. They're setting up in the main lobby. Thank you, Jennifer. Tell them I'll be down in 5 minutes. After she left, I turned back to Mason. You were saying? But the moment had passed. Mason straightened, professional mask sliding back into place. Nothing that can't wait. You should go do your interview. This is your night after all. Mason, Really, it's fine. We can talk later. He managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Go be brilliant for the cameras. I'll make sure the investors don't drink all the good champagne before you get back. As I made my way to the lobby for the interview, I couldn't help but wonder what he'd been about to ask. Whether we might try again? Whether we might finally sign the divorce papers that had been sitting unsigned in my desk drawer for months? The uncertainty gnawed at me, a distraction I couldn't afford with bright lights and camera lenses tracking my every expression. The interview went smoothly enough. Practiced answers about sustainable development and community engagement flowing easily. But my mind kept returning to the balcony, to the unfinished conversation hanging between Mason and me like a suspended note in an interrupted symphony. By the time I returned to the model unit, many of the investors had departed. Mason was deep in conversation with Richard Mercer and Diane Chen, looking tired but satisfied as they reviewed something on Diane's tablet. The interview went well, Jennifer informed me, materializing at my elbow with her uncanny timing. They're planning to run it as part of a special feature on urban renewal next week. Wonderful. Any other fires that need putting out tonight? She shook her head. Everything's under control. You should go home and get some rest. Tomorrow's board meeting will be interesting. Richard's still pushing back on the East End proposal? I guessed, referring to our next major project, a development similar to Riverside, but in an even more economically depressed area of the city. Not as forcefully as before. Tonight helped. Seeing the investors' enthusiasm for Riverside has softened his opposition, but he still has concerns about the financial risk. Don't we all? I sighed. But that's tomorrow's battle. You're right. I should head home. I made my goodbyes to the remaining guests, exchanging final handshakes and promises to follow. Up. Mason caught my eye from across the room, raising his glass in a silent toast that contained questions I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. The drive back to the estate was quiet, the radio playing soft jazz that matched my contemplative mood. The success of the evening should have left me elated, but instead, I felt a strange melancholy settling over me. Something was ending. The intense phase of proving myself, of establishing my authority at the company, and something else was beginning. Something undefined. As I pulled through the estate gates, I noticed lights burning in the main house. Unusual since I hadn't occupied it since inheriting it. I'd found the guest house more comfortable, more in keeping with who I was rather than who I was expected to be. The staff maintained the main house, of course, but it remained largely empty, a monument to my grandfather's life rather than a home for mine. Curious, I parked in front of the main entrance rather than continuing to the guest house. The front door was unlocked, and as I stepped into the grand foyer, I heard voices coming from the library. One of them unmistakably Eleanor's, her precise, cultured tones carrying even when she wasn't raising her voice. Absolutely ridiculous that you continue to indulge her, she was saying. The will has been settled for months. There's no reason to keep up this charade of a marriage. It's not a charade, Mason replied, his voice weary. And it's not your decision to make. I should have announced my presence, should have retreated to the guest house and pretended I'd heard nothing. Instead, I found myself moving closer to the partially open library door, drawn by a morbid curiosity to hear what they said when they thought I wasn't listening. She's using you, Eleanor insisted, keeping you dangling while she consolidates her power at the company. Once she's secure, she'll discard you like yesterday's newspaper. You don't know her at all if you believe that, Mason said, and the defense surprised me as much as it would have surprised his mother. Zoe's not manipulative or calculating. If anything, she's been extraordinarily fair through all of this. Fair? Eleanor's voice rose in disbelief. She took everything that should have been yours. No, Mother. Grandpa Harris left his company to the person he believed would run it best. The past 6 months have proven he was right. There was a clink of glass against glass, the sound of a drink being poured. Zoe has vision, integrity, and the courage to make difficult choices. Those are qualities he valued above family connection or business school pedigrees. I can't believe I'm hearing this, Eleanor sputtered. She's turned you against your own family. No one's turned me against anyone, Mason replied, a new firmness in his voice. I've simply had 6 months to see things clearly for the first time in my life, to recognize that the path you laid out for me, the one I've been following blindly since college, might not be the only one possible. And what path is that? Playing second fiddle to your wife at the company that should have been yours? Living in a rented condo while she occupies your grandfather's estate? That's her choice, not mine, Mason said quietly. I asked her tonight if we might consider reconciling, moving forward together, but we were interrupted before she could answer. My heart stuttered at the confirmation of what I'd suspected on the balcony. He had been about to suggest reconciliation, not divorce. And what would that reconciliation look like? Eleanor demanded. You moving into the guest house with her? Or perhaps she'd finally deign to occupy the main house that comes with her position. Those are details we'd work out together, Mason said, his patience clearly fraying. The point is, I want to try. I believe there's something worth salvaging in our marriage. Because you still love her? The skepticism in Eleanor's voice was cutting. Or because you know your position at the company is stronger with her than without her? The silence that followed her question seemed to stretch eternally. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for Mason's answer with an intensity that surprised me. Both, he admitted finally. Is that so hard to believe? That I can both love my wife and recognize that we work well together professionally? Love, Eleanor scoffed. What has love ever gotten you except a supporting role in someone else's success story? Maybe that's enough, Mason said quietly. Maybe being part of something meaningful, something that makes a real difference in people's lives, is more important than being the one whose name is on the building. I heard the clink of a glass being set down, footsteps moving toward the door. Panicking, I retreated quickly toward the foyer, trying to make it seem as if I'd just entered. I didn't quite make it before Mason emerged from the library, stopping short when he saw me. Zoe. His surprise was evident. I didn't expect. How long have you been here? I just arrived, I lied, though the flush creeping up my neck probably betrayed me. I saw lights in the main house and got curious. I didn't realize you and your mother were here. From the library doorway, Eleanor appeared, her expression shifting from shock to calculation in the space of a heartbeat. Zoe, how lovely to see you. We were just discussing the Riverside opening. Quite an achievement. The bland pleasantry after what I'd overheard was so absurd I almost laughed. Instead, I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Thank you, Eleanor. It was a team effort. Indeed. Her smile was tight. Well, I should be going. It's getting late. She kissed Mason's cheek, completely ignoring the tension vibrating between us. Think about what I said, darling. Some decisions can't be undone. After she swept out, leaving a cloud of expensive perfume in her wake, Mason and I stood in awkward silence. How much had I heard? How much should I admit to hearing? The questions hung unspoken between us. Nightcap? Mason offered finally, gesturing toward the library. I opened that Macallan 18 your grandfather was saving for a special occasion. Seemed appropriate after tonight's success. I hesitated, then nodded. One drink. The library was exactly as my grandfather had left it. Wall-to-wall bookshelves, leather chairs worn soft with age, a massive oak desk dominating one corner. The only change was the framed architectural rendering of Riverside hanging above the rye fireplace, a gift from the design team that I'd placed there months ago. Mason poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal tumbler and handed it to me. To Riverside, he toasted. And to proving the naysayers wrong. To Riverside, I echoed, sipping the scotch and letting it warm a path down my throat. We settled into the matching leather chairs by the fireplace, the familiar surroundings easing some of the tension between us. For a moment, we sat in silence, each lost in private thoughts. "How much did you hear?" Mason asked finally, his directness catching me off guard. I considered lying again, then discarded the idea. Too much had already been built on half-truths and evasions. "Enough," I admitted. "I heard Eleanor urging you to end our marriage, and I heard your response." Mason nodded slowly, studying the amber liquid in his glass. "Then you know I'm not ready to give up on us." He looked up, meeting my gaze directly. "The question is, are you?" The directness of his question left me momentarily speechless. For months, we'd circled each other cautiously, maintaining a professional partnership while avoiding any discussion of our personal relationship. Now, with nowhere to hide, I found myself struggling to articulate feelings I'd barely acknowledged even to myself. "I don't know," I said finally, the honesty a relief after so much careful diplomacy. "There are days when I look at what we've accomplished with Riverside, how well we work together, and I think maybe we could find our way back. And then there are days when I remember sitting at that dining room table, watching you hesitate when your mother suggested I'd manipulated. Your grandfather?" Mason winced. I was shocked, confused. Everything I thought I knew about my future had just been upended. "I understand that," I said softly. "But the fact remains, in that moment of crisis, your first instinct wasn't to defend me. It was to consider whether your mother might be right. And I've spent 6 months trying to prove that was a mistake," Mason countered. "Supporting your vision for the company, standing up to the board when they tried to undermine you, even defying my mother when she pushed me to contest the will. Is that why you did those things? To prove yourself to me?" Mason shook his head. "No, I did them because they were right. Because once I stepped out from under my mother's influence, I could see clearly what kind of company Harris Developments could be, should be. The kind of company your grandfather always intended it to be." He leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Working alongside you these past months has shown me what's possible when we're truly partners. Not just in business, but in creating something meaningful. Something that will outlast both of us." "And your mother? She's made it clear she doesn't support a reconciliation." Mason's laugh was short and without humor. "My mother doesn't support anything that she didn't orchestrate herself, but I'm not asking for her permission anymore. I'm asking for a chance to rebuild what we had, or maybe to build something new, something more honest than before." I studied him, trying to see past the familiar features to the man beneath. Was this genuine growth or just another strategy? Had 6 months of professional cooperation really changed the fundamental dynamic between us? "What about children?" I asked, the question that had been a point of contention throughout our marriage. "You always said you wanted to wait until your career was established, until the time was right. And you always said there would never be a perfect time, that we should trust life to unfold as it should." He smiled ruefully. "I think recent events have proven you right on that count." "That's not really an answer." Mason set his glass aside, his expression growing serious. "The honest answer is that I used the career excuse because I was afraid. Afraid of being the kind of distant, distracted father my own father was. Afraid of disappointing a child the way he disappointed me." The admission surprised me. In 3 years of marriage, Mason had rarely spoken about his father, who had abandoned the family when Mason was 8, leaving Eleanor to raise him alone. "You're not your father," I said quietly. "No, I'm not." But it took losing nearly everything to make me see that I was letting fear dictate too many of my choices. He looked around the library at the shelves of books his grandfather had collected, at the legacy now in my hands rather than his. Sometimes the worst thing you can imagine happening actually sets you free. The words resonated with my own experience. The initial shock and dismay of the inheritance giving way to a newfound confidence and sense of purpose I'd never imagined possible. "I can't give you an answer tonight," I said finally. "There's too much history, too much that would need to change." "I'm not asking for an answer tonight," Mason replied. "Just an openness to the possibility, a willingness to try." I considered this, weighing the risk against the potential reward. Despite everything, there was still something between us. Something that 6 months of separation had clarified rather than diminished. "The lease on your condo is up next month?" I asked, referring back to our interrupted conversation at Riverside. Mason nodded. "That's right." "There's a caretaker's cottage on the east side of the property," I said slowly. "It needs some work, but it has good bones. You could stay there while we figure things out. Close enough to talk, far enough for space when we need it." His eyes lit with cautious hope. "You're saying yes to trying?" "I'm saying maybe," I clarified. "One step at a time, on equal footing. No promises except to be honest with each other." Mason nodded, accepting the terms. Equal footing, honesty. I can work with that. As I drove from the main house to the guest house that night, I found myself wondering if I was making a colossal mistake or taking the first step toward healing something worth saving. The answer, I suspected, lay somewhere in the uncharted territory ahead, a path neither Mason nor I had walked before, without the influence of Eleanor's manipulations or my own tendency to diminish myself to keep the peace. The guest house was dark when I arrived, but a small package sat on the doorstep, wrapped in simple brown paper with my name written in a familiar hand. Inside was a book of poetry my grandfather had often quoted, with a note from Rebecca. "Found this while cleaning out my storage unit. Thought you might need some wisdom from the old man now that you're rewriting the rules. Call me tomorrow. I want to hear all about the Riverside opening. P.S. If Mason was there, did he finally man up and ask you about trying again? The suspense is killing me." I laughed despite myself, making a mental note to call Rebecca first thing in the morning. Of course, she'd guessed what Mason had been working toward. She'd always been more perceptive about my marriage than I was. Flipping through the book, I found a page my grandfather had marked with a pressed flower, a forget-me-not, still retaining a hint of blue despite the years. The poem was one I remembered him reciting during a difficult time in my adolescence when I'd been struggling with the pressure to conform to others' expectations. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Frost's familiar lines took on new meaning now, as I stood at a different kind of crossroads. The safe path would be to maintain the status quo, Mason and I working together professionally while keeping our personal lives separate and uncomplicated. The riskier road involved opening myself to the possibility of reconciliation, of building a marriage that looked nothing like what Eleanor had envisioned for her son, but might be stronger for having been broken and remade. I placed the book on my nightstand and prepared for bed, knowing that the board meeting tomorrow morning would require all my focus and energy. The East End project represented an even greater challenge than Riverside. More ambitious, more controversial, more aligned with my grandfather's vision for the company's future. As I drifted toward sleep, my thoughts cycled between the professional challenges ahead and the personal decision I'd just tentatively made. Both required courage, discernment, and a willingness to venture into uncharted territory without a guarantee of success. In the morning, I would face the board with confidence born of 6 months' hard-won experience. I would make my case for East End with the same conviction that had carried Riverside to triumph. And somewhere in the days that followed, Mason would move into the caretaker's cottage, beginning our careful experiment in rediscovering each other without the distorting influence of Eleanor's expectations or the imbalance of power that had characterized our marriage from the start. Two roads, indeed, and I was choosing the one less traveled by, trusting that it would make all the difference. The board meeting the next morning was every bit as contentious as Jennifer had predicted, with Richard Mercer leading the fiscal conservatives in questioning the wisdom of committing to another ambitious project so soon after Riverside. "The final numbers on Riverside aren't even in yet," he argued, tapping his pen against the financial projections I'd distributed. "We're operating on projections, not proven results. The pre-sales and commercial leasing rates are exceeding those projections," I countered. "And the East End site is available now at a price we won't see again. If we wait 6 months for Riverside's final accounting, we'll lose this opportunity." Diane Chen nodded in agreement. "The market study confirms what we're seeing anecdotally: demand. For the kind of mixed-use, sustainable development we're creating outstrips supply. East End would position us to capitalize on that demand while fulfilling our mission to revitalize underserved communities." The debate continued for nearly 2 hours, with board members splitting largely along the same lines they had during the initial Riverside discussions. But there was a notable difference this time. Mason, who had remained neutral during many of the early Riverside votes, was firmly in my corner, marshalling persuasive arguments about the long-term benefits of establishing Harris Developments as the leader in sustainable urban renewal. "We have an opportunity here to define the future of development in this city," he concluded after a particularly heated exchange. "We can either lead that future or watch as other companies copy our Riverside model and capture the market we pioneered." In the end, the vote was 7-4 in favor of proceeding with East End, a more comfortable margin than I'd expected, and a testament to how much had changed in 6 months. As the board members filed out, several stopped to congratulate me or express their excitement about the new project. Richard Mercer was notably not among them, but his objections had been milder than before, focused on timing rather than fundamental opposition. Mason lingered after the others had gone, his expression a mix of satisfaction and something more personal. "That went well." "Better than expected," I agreed, gathering my materials. "Thank you for your support." As I said last night, I believe in what we're doing. Not just the projects themselves, but the vision behind them. He hesitated, then added, "I spoke with the property manager this morning. The caretaker's cottage will be ready by the end of next week." The reminder of our personal arrangement sent a flutter of nervous anticipation through me. "So soon? Is that a problem? I can extend the condo lease if you're having second thoughts." "No," I said quickly, surprising myself with the certainty I felt. "No second thoughts, just adjusting to how quickly things are moving." Mason smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes that I hadn't seen in too long. Some decisions, once made, have their own momentum. As he turned to leave, I found myself calling after him. "Mason, would you like to have dinner tonight? To celebrate the board's approval of East End?" He looked back, surprise giving way to pleasure. "I'd like that. The usual place?" The usual place was a small Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date, long before marriage and inheritance had complicated everything between us. I hadn't been there since before my grandfather's death. "Actually," I said, making a swift decision, "how about the main house? I'll cook." Mason's eyebrows rose. "You'll cook? Should I be concerned?" The teasing reference to my notorious culinary limitations, a running joke throughout our marriage, broke the tension between us. I laughed, remembering the disaster. That was my attempt at coq au vin for our first anniversary. "Fine, I'll ask Anna to cook," I conceded, referring to the estate's part-time housekeeper who was also an excellent chef. "But I'll supervise, very closely, from a safe distance." "Deal," Mason grinned. "Should I bring anything?" I thought about it, an idea forming. "Just yourself. And maybe that bottle of Barolo we were saving for a special occasion. If you still have it." "I do," he confirmed, his expression softening at the memory of the wine we'd purchased on our honeymoon in Italy, promising each other we'd open it when we had something truly momentous to celebrate. 7 o'clock? 7 it is. After he left, I sat for a long moment in the empty boardroom, contemplating the day's victories, both professional and personal. The East End project would cement Harris Development's reputation as an innovator in sustainable urban renewal. And dinner at the main house. Well, that was a first step toward discovering whether Mason and I could build something new from the rubble of what had been broken. Neither path was without risk. Both required courage, vision, and a willingness to venture into uncharted territory. 2 roads diverging in a wood, and I was choosing the one that promised not safety or certainty, but the possibility of something extraordinary. Anna had outdone herself with dinner. The aroma of rosemary and garlic filled the main house's formal dining room, where I'd decided to set the table rather than using the more intimate breakfast nook. Something about the grand space, with its vaulted ceilings and historical family portraits, felt appropriate for this tentative new beginning with Mason. A neutral territory where we could meet as equals, rather than as husband and wife or CEO and executive. I'd arrived early to oversee the preparations, changing from my work clothes into a simple navy dress that Mason had once complimented. Not too formal, not too casual, like everything about this evening, carefully calibrated to suggest possibility without expectation. The doorbell rang precisely at 7. Mason had always been punctual, a trait I'd appreciated throughout our marriage. I opened the door myself, dismissing the housekeeper who had started toward it. "Hi," I said, taking in the sight of him on the doorstep. He wore charcoal slacks and a light blue shirt that brought out his eyes, no tie, a bottle of Barolo in one hand, and a small bouquet of tulips in the other. "Hi," he replied, his smile a bit uncertain. "I brought the wine, and these." He handed me the tulips, not roses, which would have been too romantic, nor lilies, which would have been too formal. Tulips, cheerful and unpretentious, exactly right for the occasion. "They're lovely," I said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. "Come in. Anna's almost finished in the kitchen." I led him through the grand foyer toward the dining room, aware of his eyes taking in the changes I'd made to the house over the past months. Though I still slept in the guest house, I'd gradually begun updating the main house, replacing my grandfather's more austere decorating choices with elements that reflected my own taste. Warmer colors, contemporary art alongside the family heirlooms, fresh flowers in rooms that had previously been defined by leather and dark wood. "You've been busy," Mason observed, pausing before a new painting in the hallway, a vibrant abstract from a local artist I'd discovered at a gallery opening. "I like what you've done with the place. It feels more lived in," I suggested. I was going to say yours, but yes, that too. He followed me into the dining room, where the table was set for 2 with my grandmother's china and crystal that had been gathering dust in cabinets for years. "Wow, you went all out." "Not really," I demurred, suddenly self-conscious about my efforts. "I just thought, if we're going to celebrate, we might as well do it properly." Mason held up the wine. "Should I open this now?" "Please, I'll check on dinner." In the kitchen, Anna was putting the finishing touches on an artfully arranged cheese board. "Everything is ready, Ms. Harris. The beef Wellington needs 5 more minutes, and then you can serve whenever you like." "It smells incredible," I told her. "Thank you for doing this on such short notice." She smiled knowingly. "It's good to see Mr. Mitchell here again. The house has missed him." I chose not to examine that statement too closely or to correct her anthropomorphizing of the estate. "You can head home now. We'll manage from here." When I returned to the dining room with the cheese board, Mason had opened the Barolo and poured 2 glasses. He handed me one, our fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "To the East End Project," he toasted, "and to new beginnings." I clinked my glass against his, the crystal producing a clear, resonant tone. "To new beginnings?" I echoed, taking a sip of the rich, complex wine we'd purchased in a small vineyard in Piedmont 3 years ago, when our future had seemed as clear and promising as the Italian sunlight. We settled into an easy conversation about the investor reaction to Riverside, the challenges ahead with East End, the mayor's interest in our development model, professional topics, safe and familiar, until Mason deliberately changed course. "I spoke with my mother today," he said as we finished the main course. "She knows I'm here tonight." I set down my fork, my appetite suddenly diminished. "How did that go?" "About as well as you'd expect." His wry smile held no humor. "She doesn't understand what I'm doing, why I'm," her words, "crawling back to someone who took advantage of me." The accusation stung, even secondhand. "Do you still believe that? That I somehow manipulated the situation?" Mason shook his head firmly. "No, I never really did, even in the beginning. I was shocked, confused, but deep down I knew Grandpa Harris made his own decisions. No one manipulated him, least of all you." "Then why let your mother continue thinking that?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair in the gesture I'd once found so endearing. "I've spent my entire adult life avoiding direct confrontation with her. It's a hard habit to break." "But you're trying?" "I am." He met my gaze directly. "That's part of what these past 6 months have taught me, that I need to find my own voice, make my own choices, personally and professionally." "And what are those choices, Mason?" I asked, the question that had been hovering between us all evening finally surfacing. "What do you want now?" He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer with a thoughtfulness that seemed new. The old Mason would have had a ready response, polished and confident. This version took his time, weighing his words. "I want to be worthy of the second chance I'm asking for," he said finally. "I want to rebuild what was broken between us, but on a stronger foundation. Equal partners in every sense. And if that's not possible?" I pressed. "If too much has changed? Then I still want to be the kind of man who tried." He reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin. The kind of man who recognized what he had before it was truly gone. Something shifted in the air between us. Not quite forgiveness, not quite reconciliation, but an opening, a possibility that hadn't existed before. I found myself thinking of the caretaker's cottage being prepared for him, of the careful distance we'd maintained these past months, of the unsigned divorce papers in my desk drawer. "I'm not making any promises," I said softly, "but I'm willing to try." Slowly. Mason nodded, understanding the boundaries I was setting. "Slowly works for me. We have time." We finished dinner with lighter conversation, sharing stories about the Riverside construction process, laughing over some of the more outlandish demands from potential commercial tenants. By the time we moved to the library for coffee, the awkwardness had given way to something more comfortable. Not the easy intimacy we'd once shared, but something with its own genuine warmth. Mason wandered the room as I poured coffee, pausing before the glass-enclosed shelves that housed my grandfather's most precious volumes, first editions, signed copies, literary treasures he'd collected throughout his life. "I've been meaning to ask," he said, gesturing to the books Mason had left me in the will. "Did you ever look through them? Grandpa Harris was always so protective of his first editions." "Some of them," I admitted. "They're remarkable. There's a signed Hemingway that's probably worth more than my car." Mason laughed. "That wouldn't be hard. Your car is practically an antique." "It has character," I defended, handing him a coffee cup. Besides, not all of us need to drive German engineering to feel successful. The gentle teasing felt like old times, before inheritance and power struggles had complicated everything. For a moment, I could almost imagine that the past 8 months hadn't happened, that we were simply having a normal evening at home. Then, Mason's expression grew serious again. I found something in one of the books, a letter from Grandpa Harris to me. It was tucked inside a first edition of The Great Gatsby. My curiosity piqued. What did it say? It was dated about a month before he died. He wrote that he'd made his decision about the company's succession and hoped I would understand in time. Mason stared into his coffee cup. He said he'd watched me closely my entire life, waiting for me to become the kind of man who could lead Harris developments with integrity and vision. I waited, sensing there was more. He said. Mason paused, seeming to gather himself. He said he'd seen glimpses of that man, but too often those glimpses were overshadowed by my mother's influence and my own desire for approval. He said he hoped that losing the company might be the wake-up call I needed to find my own path. The raw vulnerability in Mason's voice touched something in me, a reminder that he too had been shaped by expectations and family dynamics beyond his control. Eleanor's domineering personality had left its mark on her son just as surely as my grandfather's mentorship had left its mark on me. Was he right? I asked gently. Mason looked up, his eyes meeting mine with unexpected clarity. Yes, it was the wake-up call I needed, just not in the way anyone expected. Outside, rain began to fall, a gentle patter against the library windows. That underscored the cocoon-like feeling of the room. The two of us suspended in this moment of honesty, separated from the complications of the outside world. I should go, Mason said eventually, setting down his empty cup. Early meeting tomorrow with the community liaison team for East End. I walked him to the door, our footsteps echoing in the grand foyer. At the threshold, he turned to face me, hesitating. Thank you for tonight, he said, for being willing to try. Thank you for asking, I replied, surprised by the sincerity in my voice. He leaned forward and, for a moment, I thought he might kiss me. Instead, he pressed his lips gently to my cheek, a gesture of respect rather than presumption. Good night, Zoe. Good night, Mason. I watched his car disappear down the long driveway, processing the evening's revelations. My grandfather's letter to Mason explained so much: the careful choreography of the will, the secondary provision, his confidence in my ability to lead despite my relative inexperience. He'd been playing a longer game than any of us had realized, seeing potential in both Mason and me that we hadn't fully recognized in ourselves. As I locked the main house and made my way back to the guest house through the rain, I found myself wondering what tomorrow would bring, whether this tentative new beginning would flourish or wither under the harsh light of reality. Eleanor was still a force to be reckoned with. The company still faced challenges with the East End project, and Mason and I still had years of patterns and expectations to unravel. But for the first time in months, I felt something like hope, fragile and uncertain, but present nonetheless. My grandfather had gambled on both of us finding our way, separately and perhaps eventually together. Only time would tell if his faith was justified. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the rain having washed away the humidity and left the air crisp with the promise of early autumn. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, eager to begin preparations for the East End project kickoff, meeting scheduled for later that week. Jennifer met me at the elevator, tablet in hand and concern etched on her normally composed features. We have a situation, she said without preamble as we walked toward my office. Richard Mercer called an emergency executive committee meeting for this morning. He didn't include you on the notification list. I stopped short. Excuse me? It's scheduled for 9:30 in the small conference room. She checked her watch. 20 minutes from now. Who's on the list? Finance, legal, 2 board members, and She hesitated. And Mason, I finished for her, a cold weight settling in my stomach. Had last night been a calculated distraction? A way to keep me off guard while Richard and possibly Mason planned some kind of end run around my authority? Yes, Jennifer confirmed. But he forwarded me the meeting notification immediately with a note that you should know about it. That detail gave me pause. If Mason were conspiring with Richard, why ensure I found out about the meeting? What's on the agenda? I asked, moving again toward my office with renewed purpose. Jennifer swiped through her tablet. Officially, financial risk assessment for East End development. Unofficially? My guess is Richard's making one last attempt to derail or significantly modify the project before groundbreaking. Even. After the board vote, that's bold. I kept my voice even despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Who are the board members attending? Patricia Winters and David Goldstein. I processed this information quickly. Patricia had voted against East End, citing concerns about overextension so soon after Riverside. David had voted in favor, but had expressed reservations about the financial projections. Have Diane Chen meet me outside the small conference room in 15 minutes, I instructed Jennifer, and bring me the updated financial models for East, and including the contingency funding options we discussed yesterday. Already on your desk, Jennifer replied with her typical efficiency. And I've taken the liberty of pushing back your 10:30 with marketing. This might take a while. In my office, I reviewed the financial models, refreshing my memory on the specific concerns Richard had raised during the board meeting. The East End project was indeed ambitious, larger than Riverside, with an even greater emphasis on affordable housing and sustainable design. The projected returns were solid, but would take longer to materialize, requiring patience from investors accustomed to quicker payoffs. At precisely 9:25, I met Diane outside the small conference room. Her raised eyebrows told me she understood the situation without need for explanation. "Ready to crash a party?" she asked, adjusting her bold geometric earrings, a nervous habit I'd noticed during particularly tense meetings. "Let's see what they have to say for themselves first," I replied, opening the door without knocking. The conversation inside ceased, abruptly. Richard Mercer sat at the head of the table, a position that should have been mine had I been invited. Mason was halfway down the right side, looking oddly relieved at my appearance. Patricia Winters and David Goldstein occupied the far end, with our general counsel, Sarah Lopez, and the CFO's two senior analysts filling out the remaining seats. "Zoe?" Richard recovered first, his tone carefully modulated between surprise and welcome. "We weren't expecting you." "Clearly," I said, taking in the spread of documents across the table, many of which I recognized as financial models for East End, some with significant modifications highlighted. "Although, since you're discussing my company's largest upcoming project, I can't imagine why I wouldn't be included." "Your company?" Patricia Winters murmured, just loudly enough to be heard. I fixed her with a steady gaze. "Yes, Patricia. Harris Developments, of which I am CEO and majority shareholder." Was there some confusion about that? Her eyes dropped to the papers before her. Mason shifted in his seat, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "This was meant to be a preliminary financial review," Richard explained smoothly. "We were going to bring you the refined models once we'd worked through some of the rougher projections." "How considerate," I remarked, my voice cool. "And yet, I can't help but notice that what you have on the table appears to be a substantial redesign of the project that was approved by the full board 2 days ago." Diane moved to the side table where extra copies of the meeting materials were stacked, quickly scanning the documents. "These call for a 30% reduction in the affordable housing component," she observed, her displeasure evident, "and elimination of the community health center entirely. Temporary adjustments to improve initial cash flow," Richard countered. The full vision could be implemented in later phases, once we've established stronger returns. Later phases? That would likely never materialize once the project's fundamental character had been altered, I said, moving to the head of the table. Richard didn't budge, creating an awkward standoff. "Excuse me, Richard. I believe that's my seat." A tense moment passed before he reluctantly shifted to an adjacent chair. I remained standing, surveying the faces around the table. "I'm curious," I said, my voice deceptively casual. "When exactly did this meeting get organized? Was it before or after the board vote on East End?" David Goldstein had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Richard called me last night. He expressed concerns about the financial risks that hadn't been fully addressed during the board presentation." "Last night," I repeated, glancing at Mason. His expression gave nothing away, but a muscle ticked in his jaw, a tell I recognized from our marriage, a sign of internal conflict. "While I was hosting a dinner to celebrate the project's approval, how convenient." "This isn't personal, Zoe," Richard insisted. "It's about fiscal responsibility. East End, as currently designed, stretches our resources dangerously thin. 1. Unexpected problem with Riverside's final phase. 1 delay in the commercial leasing at East End, and we could face a serious cash flow problem. A problem for which we have multiple contingency plans, as you well know," I countered. "The board reviewed them all before voting." "The board was presented with an optimistic view," Patricia interjected. "Some of us would appreciate a more realistic assessment." I felt, rather than saw Mason tense at this implied criticism. To my surprise, he spoke up before I could respond. "What exactly are you suggesting, Patricia? That Zoe deliberately misled the board?" His voice was quiet but carried an edge I rarely heard. "Because I reviewed every projection in that presentation, as did our entire financial team. Nothing was exaggerated or minimized." Patricia blinked, clearly not expecting Mason to come to my defense. "I'm merely suggesting that enthusiasm for the social impact aspects may have overshadowed proper financial caution." "Then you haven't been paying attention," Diane said firmly. "Every aspect of East End has been structured to balance social impact with financial sustainability. The affordable housing isn't charity, it's supported by tax credits, public-private partnerships, and strategic design that actually reduces overall construction costs." I placed my hands flat on the table, leaning forward slightly. "Here's what's going to happen. This unauthorized meeting is now adjourned. Richard, you and I will discuss your concerns in my office in 1 hour. Patricia, David, if you have questions about the board presentation, I'm happy to walk through it with you again individually. But this end run around proper governance stops now." Richard's face flushed with barely contained anger. "You can't simply dismiss legitimate financial concerns because they conflict with your idealistic vision, Zoe. Harold may have given you his shares, but that doesn't mean you can run this company like your personal charity." The reference to my grandfather, coupled with the dismissive tone, ignited a flash of fury I struggled to contain. Before I could respond, Mason stood up. "That's enough, Richard," he said, his voice level but firm. "Zoe has shown nothing but financial acumen and strategic thinking since taking over as CEO. Riverside's success is proof of that. If you have specific concerns about East End, raise them through proper channels. This wasn't it." The room fell, silent as everyone absorbed the significance of Mason publicly aligning himself with me against Richard, a senior executive who had been his mother's ally and mentor throughout his career at Harris Developments. Richard gathered his papers, his movements stiff with suppressed anger. 1 hour, he agreed tersely. "Your office." As the others filed out, Mason lingered behind, waiting until the room had cleared before speaking. "I knew nothing about this until Jennifer forwarded me Richard's meeting invite this morning," he said quietly. "I was going to text you, but I thought it might be better if you walked in unexpectedly." I studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. "Richard didn't discuss this with you last night? Or earlier?" Mason shook his head. "No, though he did call after he left my condo last week, asking pointed questions about my influence with you regarding East End. I shut him down, told him any concerns should go directly to you." "Why didn't you tell me about that call?" "Because it seemed like typical Richard, testing the waters, looking for leverage. I didn't think he'd go this far." Mason's expression was troubled. He's been Eleanor's friend for years. I wonder if she put him up to this. The possibility hadn't occurred to me, but it made a certain sense. Eleanor had been suspiciously quiet lately, her usual interference channeled into charity work rather than direct confrontation. Perhaps she'd simply found a new avenue for undermining me. "It doesn't matter who's behind it," I said finally. "What matters is that the board approved East End as designed. If Richard or anyone else wants to challenge that decision, they'll need to bring something more substantial than reheated concerns we've already addressed." Mason nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "You handled that well. Firm but professional." "I learned from the best," I acknowledged, thinking of my grandfather's masterful management of boardroom dynamics. "Thank you, by the way, for speaking up." "I meant what I said. You've proven yourself as CEO. Anyone who can't see that is either not paying attention or deliberately ignoring the evidence." He checked his watch. "I should get going. I have a meeting with the East End Community Advisory Board in 20 minutes. "The one Richard wanted to eliminate in his revised plan," I noted wryly. "Exactly." A ghost of a smile crossed Mason's face. "I'll let you know how it goes." After he left, I found myself standing alone in the conference room, processing what had just happened. The attempted end run around my authority was concerning but not entirely surprising. What was unexpected was Mason's unequivocal support, not tentative or calculating, but immediate and firm. Either he was playing an exceptionally long game, or he had genuinely changed. The Mason I had married would have hedged, looked for middle ground, tried to appease both sides. This version had chosen a clear position, even at the cost of alienating his mother's ally. I gathered the scattered meeting materials, noting with professional detachment the substantial changes Richard had proposed. His revisions effectively gutted the project's social impact components while maximizing short-term profits, exactly the approach my grandfather had been moving away from in his final years. By the time Richard arrived at my office an hour later, I had thoroughly reviewed his alternate proposal and prepared my response. Jennifer showed him in, her expression neutral, but her posture protective as she closed the door behind him. "Sit down, Richard," I said, not looking up from the documents spread across my desk. I let the silence stretch, knowing it would unsettle him more than immediate confrontation. "I want to apologize for this morning," he began when the silence had stretched to discomfort. "The meeting was procedurally inappropriate. I should have brought my concerns directly to you." I looked up then, noting the careful phrasing, an apology for the method, not the intent. "Yes, you should have, especially since every concern in this revised proposal was addressed and resolved during the board review process." "Not to everyone's satisfaction," he countered, some of his usual confidence returning. "Patricia and David both had reservations they felt weren't adequately explored. Then, Patricia and David should have exercised their board authority by voting against the project or requesting more time for review. They didn't. The board approved East End as presented." I closed the folder containing his proposal. "So, unless you have new financial concerns that weren't covered in our extensive review process, this conversation is over." Richard's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Zoe. Your grandfather understood the need for financial discipline. He wouldn't have approved a project with such thin margins and extended return timelines." The invocation of my grandfather, again, threatened to crack my professional composure. I took a measured breath before responding. My grandfather left me very clear guidance about the direction he wanted this company to take. East End represents that vision: balanced, sustainable growth that serves both our financial interests and the communities where we build. I met his gaze directly. If that vision no longer aligns with your professional values, Richard, we should have a different conversation. He stiffened, hearing the implicit threat. Are you suggesting I should resign? I'm suggesting you need to decide whether you can fully support the company's direction going forward. Because this, I tapped the folder containing his unauthorized revisions, isn't support, it's sabotage. A tense silence filled the office as Richard visibly struggled with his response. Finally, he straightened his shoulders, his expression cooling into professional detachment. I understand your position. For the record, my concerns were and remain purely financial. But I acknowledge that the board has made its decision, and as CFO, I will execute that decision to the best of my ability. It wasn't quite submission, but it was acceptance, at least for now. I nodded, recognizing the professional olive branch for what it was. That's all I ask, Richard. Your financial expertise is valuable to this company. I'd prefer to have it working for East End rather than against it. He rose to leave, pausing at the door. Just one question, if I may. Was it your idea to have Mason speak to the East End Community Advisory Board, or his? The question seemed odd, disconnected from our discussion of the project financials. His? Why? A cryptic smile touched Richard's lips. Just curious about the dynamics these days. Good day, Zoe. After he left, I sat back in my chair, puzzling over the strange exchange. What had Richard been fishing for? Information about my relationship with Mason? Confirmation of some theory about who was really making decisions? I was still contemplating this when Jennifer buzzed to announce that Diane Chen had arrived with updated renderings for the East End Welcome Center. Send her in, I instructed, pushing thoughts of Richard and his machinations aside. There was real work to be done, a project to be built, a vision to be realized. Office politics would always be part of the job, but they couldn't be allowed to overshadow the actual purpose of Harris Developments. As Diane spread the renderings across the conference table in my office, explaining her team's latest innovations in sustainable materials and energy-efficient design, I felt my focus sharpening, my purpose clarifying. This was what mattered, creating something of lasting value, something that would transform lives and communities long after boardroom squabbles had been forgotten. These are extraordinary, Diane, I said, genuinely impressed by the elegant solutions her team had developed. The integration of the health center with the community spaces is seamless. That was Mason's suggestion, actually, she admitted, pointing to a central courtyard design. He's been surprisingly engaged with this project, more than I've ever seen him before. It's like he's finally found his voice as a developer. Her observation echoed my own thoughts from the previous evening. Something had changed in Mason. These past months, a shift from performing the role he thought he should play to discovering what he actually cared about. People can surprise you, I murmured, studying the rendering where community gardens connected to the health center's nutritional education program, a holistic approach to wellness that went far beyond typical development considerations. Speaking of surprises, Diane said, her tone deliberately casual. I couldn't help but notice at the investor event that you and Mason seemed more comfortable with each other lately. Office gossip has been speculating for weeks about a potential reconciliation. I looked up sharply. Office gossip should find more productive topics. Diane held up her hands in mock surrender. Just making conversation. Though for what it's worth, most people are rooting for you two. Mason's different now. Less Eleanor's puppet, more his own person. Anyone who works with him can see it. The characterization was harsh, but not entirely inaccurate. The old Mason had indeed acted as Eleanor's proxy in many ways, advancing her agenda while maintaining plausible deniability about his influence. People change, I acknowledged, steering the conversation back to professional ground. Now tell me more about these solar panels integrated into the playground canopies. That's innovative. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings and decisions, the East End project taking more concrete shape with each discussion. By late afternoon, I was reviewing community benefit agreements with our legal team when Jennifer appeared. At my door. "Mason's here to see you," she announced. "He says it's important." I glanced at the clock, surprised to see it was already past 6. "Send him in." Mason entered, looking energized despite the late hour. "The community advisory board meeting was incredible," he said without preamble. "They've proposed a workforce development program tied to the construction phase, training local residents for sustainable building trades, creating a pipeline for skilled jobs even after East End is complete." His enthusiasm was contagious, his eyes bright with possibility. "That's brilliant," I agreed. "It addresses one of the biggest criticisms of urban renewal projects, that they create temporary construction jobs but no sustainable employment for neighborhood residents." "Exactly." Mason pulled up a chair, his usual professional reserve, forgotten in his excitement. "We'd need to partner with the technical college for certification programs, but their director was at the meeting and she's already on board. We could create a model that transforms not just the physical neighborhood, but its economic foundation." For the next hour, we sketched out possibilities, building on each other's ideas with a synchronicity that felt both familiar and new. This was what had drawn us together initially, before Eleanor's expectations and corporate politics had complicated everything. This shared passion for reimagining what development could be. When we finally paused, both slightly breathless from the rapid exchange of ideas, I became acutely aware of how close we were sitting, how the professional distance we'd maintained these past months had temporarily dissolved in our shared enthusiasm. Mason seemed to realize it at the same moment, self-consciousness replacing animation as he sat back slightly. "Sorry for barging in like this. I just thought you should hear about it right away." "I'm glad you did," I assured him. "This is exactly the kind of innovation that sets Harris Developments apart." A comfortable silence settled between us, neither awkward nor charged, but simply peaceful. Outside my office windows, the city lights were beginning to twinkle against the darkening sky. "Have you eaten?" Mason asked suddenly. "I just realized. It's nearly 8, and I doubt you stopped for lunch." The question was casual, but carried echoes of our marriage. How often he'd asked that exact question when I was absorbed in work, forgetting basic self-care in my focus on a project. "I had a sandwich," I said defensively, then admitted, "at some point, possibly noon." He smiled, the familiar, genuine smile I'd first fallen for years ago. "There's a new Thai place 2 blocks over. They do incredible pad Thai. We could grab takeout, continue working on this community partnership idea." The invitation hung in the air, neither presumptuous nor tentative. Just an offer, with no pressure or expectation attached. "Thai sounds perfect," I decided. "Let me just finish up here." As I gathered my things, I caught Jennifer's knowing glance through the glass partition. She quickly averted her eyes, but not before I registered her approval. Diane's earlier comment about office gossip came back to me, and I wondered just how closely our staff had been watching the careful dance between Mason and me these past months. Outside, the September evening was pleasantly cool, the streets still busy with after-work crowds and early dinner-goers. We walked the 2 blocks to the Thai restaurant in companionable silence, the kind that had once been common between us before tension and unspoken grievances had filled every space. "Richard cornered me after you left today," Mason said as we waited for our takeout order. "He wanted to know whose side I was on in the East End discussion." I raised an eyebrow. "And what did you tell him?" "That I wasn't aware there were sides in a project the board had already approved." Mason's expression was contemplative. "He mentioned that he'd seen Eleanor for lunch last week. The confirmation of my earlier suspicion didn't surprise me. She's still trying to control things from a distance. Always, Mason agreed, with a rueful smile. Though I think she's beginning to recognize it's not working as well as it used to. Our order arrived, fragrant steam escaping from the paper bags as we made our way back toward the office building. Instead of returning to my formal office, however, Mason steered us toward the small break room on our floor, with its comfortable couches and less corporate atmosphere. I thought we could use a change of scenery, he explained, setting out the containers on the coffee table. Less intimidating than your executive suite. We ate straight from the takeout boxes, passing containers back and forth as we continued, refining the workforce development concept, sketching ideas on napkins and typing notes into our phones. The casual setting and shared meal created an intimacy that felt both nostalgic and new, reminiscent of our early dating days when we'd work on projects together in coffee shops and university libraries. We make a good team, Mason observed. As we finished, the statement simple but weighted with implication. Professionally speaking. We do, I agreed, carefully maintaining the professional framing he'd offered. When we're both bringing our best ideas forward. And personally speaking, he asked, taking the conversation where we'd both been. Careful not to go. Do you think we could be a good team again in that arena too? The directness of the question caught me off guard. I looked down at the empty containers, buying time to formulate a response that was neither dismissive nor overly encouraging. I think, I said slowly, that we're still figuring that out. One dinner at a time, one Thai takeout at a time. Mason nodded, accepting the measured response. Fair enough. The caretaker's cottage will be ready next week. No pressure, but I wanted you to know. Thank you for telling me. We cleaned up in companionable silence, disposing of the empty containers and wiping down the small table. As we prepared to leave, Mason paused by the door. It's late. Can I walk you to your car? Such a small courtesy, yet it represented the kind of thoughtfulness that had been absent in the later stages of our marriage, when professional ambition and Eleanor's expectations had overshadowed simpler connections. I'd like that, I said. The Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom glittered. With crystal chandeliers and the jewels of Boston's elite, Eleanor's annual charity gala for the Children's Hospital was the social event of the season, and she had spared no expense in creating a winter wonderland of white roses and silver accents. I stood at the entrance, smoothing the emerald silk of my gown while Mason adjusted his bow tie beside me. Are you sure about this? He asked quietly, his eyes searching mine. Absolutely, I replied with more confidence than I felt. We had agreed to attend together, making our first public appearance as a couple since the inheritance and all the chaos that followed. 6 months of careful professional collaboration and 2 weeks of Mason living in the caretaker's cottage had led to this moment, a deliberate statement that whatever happened between us was our choice, not Eleanor's. She's at the champagne fountain, Mason observed, nodding toward his mother who held court across the room, resplendent in silver that matched her steel gray hair. Looks like she's already spotted us. Eleanor's smile had indeed frozen mid-conversation, her eyes narrowing slightly as she registered our arrival together. I took a steadying breath and slipped my hand into Mason's. Let's get this over with, I murmured. As we made our way across the room, I felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere, conversations pausing, heads turning, the speculative glances of Boston society eager for the next installment of the Harris Mitchell drama. Board members from Harris Developments nodded in greeting, their eyes tracking our progress toward Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. Mason, darling, Eleanor exclaimed as we approached, her voice carrying just enough to ensure nearby guests could hear. And Zoe, what a pleasant surprise. I wasn't sure you'd attend. We wouldn't miss it, Mason replied smoothly. The Children's Hospital is such an important cause. Eleanor's practiced smile didn't reach her eyes as she assessed me. That dress is certainly bold. I believe I recommended the Black Valentino when we discussed the gala last year. You did, I agreed pleasantly. But emerald suits me better, don't you think? Before she could respond, Richard Mercer appeared at her elbow, his expression carefully neutral. Zoe, Mason, good to see you both. The Riverside opening was quite impressive last week. The mayor hasn't stopped talking about it. Thank you, Richard, I said, genuinely appreciative of the professional acknowledgement despite our ongoing tensions at the office. The community response has exceeded our projections. Speaking of projections, Eleanor interrupted, her voice taking on a concerned tone that immediately put me on alert. I've heard some concerning rumors about East End. Several investors at my table were discussing the financial risks just earlier. Mason tensed beside me, but I squeezed his hand gently. This was exactly the kind of manipulation we had anticipated. How fortunate that both the CEO and head of community partnerships for Harris Developments are here to address any concerns, I replied smoothly. Perhaps you could point out these worried investors so we can reassure them directly? Eleanor's smile tightened fractionally. They've stepped away, I believe. But Mason, darling, I've saved you a seat at the head table. You too, of course. Zoe? She added as an afterthought. Actually, Mother, Mason said, his voice gentle but firm. Zoe and I have our own table this evening. Several of the East End Community Board members are joining us. They're first-time donors to the hospital fund. The flash of displeasure that crossed Eleanor's face was quickly masked. How progressive of you. Well, don't let me keep you from your guests. We'll catch up properly later. As we moved away, Mason let out a slow breath. Round 1, complete. That wasn't so bad. She's just warming up, I cautioned. The night is young. Our table was indeed filled with new faces, community leaders from the East End neighborhood who had embraced our development vision and contributed to Eleanor's charity as a gesture of partnership. Their presence was both a professional victory and a personal statement. This new version of Harris Developments would bridge worlds that had previously remained separate, bringing diverse perspectives to the table both literally and figuratively. Dinner progressed smoothly, the conversation flowing easily among our guests who seemed blissfully unaware of the undercurrents swirling through the ballroom. I was just beginning to relax when I noticed Eleanor making her way to the stage for the evening's formal program. Here we go, Mason murmured, his hand finding mine beneath the table. Eleanor took the microphone with practiced ease, her voice carrying perfectly through the large space. Welcome, friends, to our 15th annual gala benefiting Boston Children's Hospital. She paused for applause. Tonight we celebrate not just generosity, but legacy, the impact we create that outlives us. My spine stiffened at the word legacy, too pointed to be coincidental. Many of you know that our family has experienced significant changes this year, Eleanor continued, her gaze sweeping across the room to land briefly on our table. My dear father-in-law, Harold Harris, left us in body, but his vision continues. Through Harris Developments, now under new leadership. The room grew quiet, sensing the delicate territory she was entering. Mason's grip on my hand tightened. I'm pleased to announce that tonight's gala has raised over $2 million for the Children's Hospital, Eleanor said, drawing appreciative murmurs from the crowd. And I'm even more pleased to announce a special matching donation from the newly established Harold Harris Community Development Fund, created by my daughter-in-law, Zoe Harris. A spotlight suddenly found me, and all eyes in the ballroom turned in my direction. I struggled to keep my expression neutral despite my shock. This matching donation was news to me. I had established the fund, yes, but had made no commitment to match tonight's gala proceeds. Zoe, Eleanor continued, her smile razor-sharp, why don't you come up and tell everyone about this wonderful contribution? It was a masterful trap, refuse, and I would appear petty and ungenerous. Except, and I would be committing the foundation to an unplanned $1 million expenditure. Eleanor had found the perfect battlefield, public philanthropy, where Objections would seem callous regardless of their validity. Mason leaned close to whisper in my ear. "She's trying to force your hand. What do you want to do?" I considered my options for a split second before rising to my feet. "I'll handle this," I assured him, straightening my shoulders as I made my way to the stage. Eleanor's triumph was visible only in the gleam of her eyes as she handed me the microphone. "Isn't this exciting?" she gushed for the audience's benefit. $2 million for the children." I accepted the microphone with a calm I didn't entirely feel. "Thank you, Eleanor, for that unexpected announcement." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. The Harold Harris Community Development Fund was indeed established to continue my grandfather's commitment to creating positive impact in underserved communities. I paused, gathering my thoughts. While we hadn't planned to announce this tonight, I'm pleased to share that the fund will be matching tonight's remarkable donations, not just with money, but with action. Eleanor's smile faltered slightly as I continued. "For every dollar raised tonight, we will be investing a matching amount in the new pediatric wellness center that will be built as part of the East End development, creating a direct extension of the hospital's services in a community that has historically lacked access to quality health care." The crowd burst into enthusiastic applause, particularly from our table of East End community leaders. I hadn't planned this announcement, but the idea had been forming for weeks in conversations with Mason and the development team, a natural extension of our community partnership vision. We believe, as my grandfather did, that true philanthropy isn't just about writing checks. It's about creating sustainable systems that address root causes, I continued, looking directly at Eleanor while addressing the room. The Children's Hospital does remarkable work. Now we'll help bring that work directly into neighborhoods where it's most needed. As the applause grew louder, I handed the microphone back to Eleanor, whose expression was locked in a society smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How wonderful," she managed. "Such creative thinking." The rest of the evening unfolded in a blur of congratulations and conversations about the wellness center concept. Board members who had been hesitant about East End now approached with renewed interest, seeing the potential partnerships and positive publicity. Even Richard Mercer grudgingly acknowledged the strategic brilliance of connecting Harris Development's work with the established prestige of the Children's Hospital. It was nearly midnight when Mason and I finally made our escape, leaving behind a still buzzing ballroom and an Eleanor who had maintained her composure, but avoided any further direct interaction with us. "That," Mason said as we stepped into the cool night air, "was the most masterful counter-move I've ever witnessed." I laughed, exhilaration finally replacing the tension that had carried me through the evening. I wasn't planning it, honestly, but when she tried to back me into a corner. "You found a door," he finished, helping me into my coat. "Grandpa Harris would have been proud." The drive back to the estate was quiet, both of us processing the evening's events. When we pulled up to the main house, neither of us made a move to exit the car immediately. "Would you like to come in for a nightcap?" I asked, the question hanging between us with implications beyond a simple drink. Mason turned to face me, his expression serious in the dim light. "Zoe, tonight was incredible. Watching you handle Eleanor, seeing how you've truly made the company your own, it just confirms what I've been feeling these past months." "Which is?" I prompted when he paused. "That I'm falling in love with you all over again. Not as the woman I married, but as the woman you've become." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of vulnerability I'd always found endearing. "But I don't want to rush this. Whatever we're rebuilding, I want it to have a solid foundation." The honesty in his voice touched something deep within me. "Rain check on that nightcap, then?" He smiled, relieved. "Rain check. But I'd like to take you to dinner tomorrow, if you're free. A proper date, not takeout at the office or cooking experiments at the guest house." "I'd like that," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. Outside the car, Mason walked me to the main house door. Before I could reach for my keys, he leaned in and kissed me. Not the tentative, careful kiss I might have expected, but something sure and steady that spoke of newfound confidence and clarity. "Good night, Zoe," he said softly as he pulled away. "Good night, Mason." Inside, I kicked off my heels and padded through the darkened house to the library, drawn to the space that still felt most like my grandfather. His portrait hung above the fireplace, his eyes seeming to twinkle with approval in the moonlight streaming through the windows. "You planned this all along, didn't you?" I said to the painting, sinking into his favorite leather chair. "You knew what would happen when you left everything to me instead of Mason." The portrait offered no answer, but I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. "I knew what you were capable of, if given the chance to stand on your own." 6 months ago, I had sat in this same chair, devastated by betrayal and uncertain of my future. Now I ran a thriving company, had successfully launched 2 groundbreaking development projects, and was cautiously rebuilding a relationship on entirely new terms. The inheritance that had initially seemed like a burden had become a gift, not just of wealth and position, but of self-discovery. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Heard you stole the show at Eleanor's gala. Details tomorrow. Proud of you, cuz." I smiled, typing back a quick reply before heading upstairs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, finalizing the wellness center concept, navigating the continuing evolution of my relationship with Mason, dealing with whatever counter move Eleanor might be planning. But for tonight, I could savor the victory, both professional and personal. As I passed by the window overlooking the property, I noticed a light still burning in the caretaker's cottage. Mason was awake too, perhaps replaying the evening as I was contemplating our shared future. Not as husband-controlling wife or wife-supporting husband, but as true partners, in business, in purpose, in life. The inheritance had changed everything, just as my grandfather had intended. But the real legacy wasn't the company or the wealth. It was the wisdom to recognize that true happiness comes not from meeting others' expectations, but from having the courage to chart your own course. My course was clear now. Whatever the easy future held with Mason, with Eleanor, with Harris Developments, I would face it on my own terms, with my own strength, creating a legacy that would make my grandfather proud. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.